The leather hinges on the saloon doors creaked their familiar protest as Willa Daniels pushed through into the smoky interior of the Golden Eagle, her arms laden with fresh linens for the upstairs guest rooms where she worked as a chambermaid. It was late afternoon in Fort Worth, Texas, and the September heat of 1878 still clung to everything like a second skin. She had been working at the establishment for 3 months now, ever since her father passed from fever and left her alone in this rough cattle town with nothing but her reputation and her determination to survive honestly. The main room was already filling with cowboys fresh off the Kishom Trail, their pockets heavy with months of wages and their throats parched for whiskey. Willa kept her eyes forward as she always did, moving quickly toward the back stairs that would take her to the upper floor where she could complete her work and leave before the evening truly got rowdy. She was 20 years old, dark-haired and fair-skinned, with green eyes that her mother used to say were like spring grass after rain. Her calico dress was simple but clean, the hem dusty from the unpaved streets outside. "Well now, would you look at what just walked in?" a voice called out from near the card tables. Willa recognized it immediately. Chet Morrison, one of the local troublemakers who seemed to spend more time gambling and drinking than doing any honest work. He sat with his usual companions, Frank Ridley and Tom Hutchins, 3 men who thought their swagger and their guns made them kings of this town. Willa ignored them and continued walking, her spine straight and her jaw set. She had dealt with men like this before. The best policy was always to give them no attention whatsoever. "I am talking to you, girl," Chet called again, his voice louder now. Several conversations around the room died down as heads turned to watch. "Heard some interesting things about you from old Pete down at the livery. Says you were mighty friendly with him last week when you needed a ride out to the widow Callahan's place." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Willa stopped mid-stride, her cheeks flushing hot. Old Pete was 70 if he was a day, and he had given her a ride as a simple kindness because she had been carrying medicine to the sick woman. There was nothing improper about it, nothing at all, but Chet was implying something dark and completely false. "You best watch your mouth about things you know nothing about," Willa said, turning to face him. Her voice shook slightly, but she held her ground. "Pete was being neighborly, which is something you would know nothing about." Frank Ridley laughed, a mean sound. "Neighborly. That is what they are calling it now. I heard she is real neighborly with anyone who has $1, Tom Hutchins added, and the 3 of them erupted in laughter that made Willa's stomach turn. The bartender, Sam, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. He was not the owner, just an employee like her, and he had no authority to throw out paying customers. Willa felt tears prick at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her reputation was all she had in this town. If these men spread their poison, she could lose her job, lose everything. "That is a lie," she said, her voice stronger now. "I work honest and I live honest, and you all know it." "Do we?" Chet stood up from his chair, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. He was not drawing it, just reminding everyone in the room that he was armed. "Maybe we should ask around, see what other folks have to say about the virtuous Miss Daniels." Before Willa could respond, the saloon doors opened again. The man who entered had to duck slightly to clear the frame, and when he straightened to his full height, he seemed to fill the entire doorway. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they strained against his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered and tanned from years in the sun. His arms were thick with muscle, visible even through his sleeves, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to prove because everyone already knew. Willa had seen him before, though she had never spoken to him. Everyone in Fort Worth knew about Henry Yates, the mountain man who came down from Colorado Territory every few months to sell his furs and stock up on supplies. He kept to himself mostly, but there were stories about him. Stories about how he had fought off a grizzly bear with just a knife. Stories about how he had tracked outlaws through mountain passes where no other man would dare to go. Stories about how he was faster with a rifle than most men were with their thoughts. Henry's eyes swept the room and took in the scene immediately. Chet still standing with his hand near his gun, Willa clutching her linens with white knuckles, the uncomfortable silence that meant something bad had been happening. His gaze settled on Willa's face, and something in his expression hardened. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was deep and quiet, but it carried through the room like thunder in the distance. Chet turned to face him, trying to maintain his bravado. "No problem, mountain man. Just having a conversation with the lady here about her habits. Her habits." Henry moved into the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He was not going for his weapons, a Colt revolver on his right hip and a large knife on his left, but everyone was aware of them. "That is interesting, because from where I am standing, it looked like 3 grown men were harassing a woman trying to do her work." "We were just talking," Frank said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "No," Henry said, stopping a few feet from their table. "You were spreading lies about a decent woman's character. I was outside on the porch. I heard every word you said through the window." The room was completely silent now. Even the piano player had stopped his endless tinkling of the keys. "You calling us liars?" Tom asked, but his hand stayed well away from his gun. "I am calling you exactly what you are," Henry said. "Liars and cowards who think they can say whatever they want about a woman because she has no man to defend her name." He turned to look at Willa, and his expression softened just slightly. "Miss, did these men speak false about you?" Willa found her voice, though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Yes, sir. Every word was a lie. I have never been anything but respectable." Henry nodded once, then turned back to the 3 men. "You heard her. Now you are going to apologize." Chet laughed, but it sounded forced. "Like hell we are, you cannot make us." "Cannot I?" Henry took another step forward. He still had not touched his weapons, but the threat in his posture was unmistakable. "See, I grew up in these mountains learning that there are 2 kinds of men in this world. Men who speak truth and honor women, and men who lie and dishonor them. My father taught me that the second kind are not really men at all. They are just children in men's clothing, and sometimes children need to be taught lessons. You threatening us?" Frank stood up now too, and Tom followed suit. 3 against 1, but nobody in the room thought those were good odds for the 3. "I am giving you a choice," Henry said calmly. "You can apologize to Miss Daniels here and now, sincere-like, and we can all go about our evening. Or you can refuse, and I will make you apologize. The second way will hurt considerable more." Willa held her breath. She knew she should say something, should tell Henry that it was not worth fighting over, but the words would not come. For 3 months, she had endured whispers and suggestions and crude comments, always swallowing her anger because she had no choice. Now here was this man, this stranger, standing up for her when no one else would. "I am not apologizing to any woman," Chet said, and his hand moved toward his gun. He never cleared leather. Henry moved like a rattlesnake striking, so fast that Willa barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, the next his hand had shot out and grabbed Chet's wrist, squeezing. There was an audible crack and Chet screamed, dropping to his knees. His gun clattered to the floor. Frank went for his weapon, but Henry was faster, his other hand coming around in a fist that caught Frank square in the jaw. The man went down like a sack of grain, out cold before he hit the floor. Tom froze, his hand halfway to his holster. Henry released Chet's wrist and turned to face him, and Tom slowly raised both hands in surrender. "I think you broke my wrist," Chet gasped, cradling his arm. "Probably," Henry agreed. "Now apologize to the lady." "I apologize," Chet said quickly, pain making his voice high and thin. "Not good enough," Henry said. "Say her name, look at her, tell her you are sorry for lying about her character." Chet looked up at Willa, tears of pain streaming down his face. "Miss Daniels, I am sorry for lying about your character. Everything I said was false. You are a decent woman, and I had no right to speak about you that way." Henry looked at Tom. "Your turn." Tom did not need to be hit. "Miss Daniels, I sincerely apologize for the lies I told about you. It was wrong, and I am ashamed. You have my word I will tell everyone the truth, that you are a good and honest woman." "And him," Henry said, pointing at Frank, who was starting to stir on the floor. Tom bent down and shook his friend until Frank groaned and opened his eyes. "You need to apologize to Miss Daniels," Tom hissed. Frank looked up, saw Henry standing over him, and the words tumbled out. "I am sorry, Miss Daniels. I lied. You are respectable, and I was wrong to say otherwise." Henry looked at Willa. "Is that acceptable to you, miss?" Willa found herself nodding, though she still felt stunned by how quickly everything had happened. Yes, that is acceptable." "Good." Henry turned back to the three men. "Now here is how this is going to work. Come morning, before the sun rises, you three are going to meet me in front of this saloon. You are going to apologize again, properly this time, where other folks can hear. You are going to spread the word all over town that Miss Daniels is a respectable woman, and that anyone who says otherwise is calling you liars. Is that clear?" "My wrist is broken," Chet moaned. "Then you better hope the doctor can see you tonight," Henry said without sympathy. "Is that clear?" All three men nodded, and Henry stepped back. "Get out of here, all of you. And if I hear even one more word spoken against Miss Daniels, I will find you. I do not care if I have to ride all the way to Mexico. I will find you, and we will finish this conversation." They did not need to be told twice. Chet stumbled toward the door, supported by Tom, and Frank followed close behind, still shaking his head to clear it. The saloon doors swung shut behind them, and the room erupted in conversation. Henry turned to Willa, and his expression softened. Up close he was even more imposing, but his brown eyes were kind. "I apologize if I overstepped, miss. I know you did not ask for my help, but I heard what they were saying, and I could not let it stand." "You did not overstep," Willa said, finding her voice at last. "Thank you. I have been dealing with talk like that ever since I started working here, but no one has ever stood up for me before." "Then this town is full of cowards," Henry said simply. "A woman should not have to defend her own honor against lies. That is what men are supposed to do." Sam the bartender came over, looking relieved. "That was something, Henry. Drinks are on the house tonight." "I appreciate it, Sam, but I will pay my way." Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out some coins. "Whiskey, if you please." Willa realized she was still standing there holding her linens like a fool. "I should get back to work." "Wait," Henry said. "If you do not mind me asking, what time do you finish your duties here?" "Usually around 7, before the evening crowd gets too rowdy." "Would you do me the honor of having dinner with me tonight? There is a decent restaurant down the street, the one with the blue sign. Nothing fancy, but the food is good." Willa hesitated. She did not know this man, but he had just defended her when no one else would. And there was something about him, something solid and trustworthy in his eyes. "I would like that," she said. "Thank you." "The pleasure is mine, Miss Daniels. I will meet you outside here at 7. Willa nodded and hurried up the stairs, her mind spinning. When she reached the quiet of the upper hallway, she had to stop and lean against the wall for a moment. Her hands were shaking. It was not fear exactly, but rather the release of fear that had been building for months. And something else too. Something warm in her chest when she thought about Henry Yates and the way he had looked at those men like they were less than dust. She finished her work in a daze, changing linens and straightening rooms. Her mind kept replaying the scene downstairs, the casual way Henry had handled 3 armed men like it was nothing at all. But it was not the violence that stuck with her, limited as it had been. It was the way he had asked if the apologies were acceptable to her, the way he had given her the choice, the way he had called her a decent woman and made everyone in that room believe it. At 7, she came back downstairs, having washed her face and hands and smoothed her hair as best she could. Henry was waiting outside as promised, and he smiled when he saw her. It changed his whole face, made him look younger and less intimidating. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. She took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath the buckskin, and they walked down the dusty street together. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Fort Worth was settling in for the evening, shops closing and saloons opening, the eternal rhythm of a cattle town. The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and oil lamps on every table. The owner, a stout German woman named Mrs. Hoffman, greeted Henry like an old friend. "Henry Yates, you are back in town. It has been too long." Then she noticed Willa and her eyebrows rose with interest. "And you have brought a lovely young lady. Come, come, I will give you the best table." She led them to a corner table away from the other diners, a spot that offered some privacy. Once they were seated with menus in hand, Mrs. Hoffman disappeared into the kitchen, but not before giving Henry a meaningful look that made him chuckle. "I apologize for her," he said. "She has been trying to marry me off for years now." Willa smiled. "How do you know her?" "My father used to trade with her husband before he passed. I was just a boy then, but she always remembered me. Now every time I come to Fort Worth she feeds me like she is trying to fatten me up for winter." "You come here often?" "Every few months. I trap and hunt up in the Colorado mountains, then bring the furs down to sell. Fort Worth has good markets and good people for the most part." "For the most part," Willa echoed, thinking of Chet and his friends. Henry's expression darkened. "Men like that exist everywhere, I am afraid. The West attracts some good people looking for opportunity, but it also attracts people running from something or people who think they can act however they want, because there is less law out here." Mrs. Hoffman returned with 2 plates of roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables before they had even ordered. "I know what you like," she said firmly. "And you are too skinny, girl. You need meat on your bones." After she left again, Willa laughed. "I have never been called too skinny in my life." "She says that to everyone," Henry assured her. "But she is not wrong that you should eat. When was the last time you had a good meal?" Willa realized she could not remember. She usually ate whatever scraps were left in the saloon kitchen, bread and cheese mostly, whatever Sam did not mind her taking. A meal like this was a luxury she could not afford on her wages. "It has been a while," she admitted. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Willa found herself studying Henry when she thought he was not looking. He had strong hands, scarred and calloused from hard work. His face was weathered but handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, though it was hard to tell with men who lived such rough lives. "Can I ask you something?" Henry said after a while. "Of course." "What is a woman like you doing working in a saloon? You are clearly educated and well-spoken. There must be other opportunities. Willa set down her fork. My father died 3 months ago. He was a school teacher, and after he passed, the town council hired a man to replace him. They said it was not proper for a woman to teach. I had no other skills and no family, so the saloon was the only place hiring. I work as a chambermaid, keeping the rooms clean. It is honest work, even if the location is not ideal. I am sorry about your father. Thank you. He was a good man. He taught me to read and write, taught me mathematics and history. He always said education was the key to a better life. She smiled sadly. I suppose he was right, just not for me. It is not right, Henry said, his voice firm. You should not have to work in a place like that, dealing with drunk cowboys and men who think they can say whatever they want to you. But I do, Willa said simply. That is the reality. I need money for rent and food. The saloon pays better than most places would pay a woman, even if it comes with difficulties. Henry was quiet for a long moment, and Willa could see he was thinking hard about something. Finally, he said, "What if there was another option?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you did not have to work at the saloon anymore?" Willa felt her cheeks flush. "Mr. Yates, I appreciate what you did for me today more than I can say, but I cannot accept charity. I have to make my own way." "I am not offering charity," Henry said. "I am offering a job." "A job?" "I have a cabin up in the Colorado mountains near a place called Summit Springs. It is a good cabin, solid, with a creek nearby and plenty of game. But it is just me up there, and the truth is I could use help. Someone to keep the cabin while I am out on the trap lines, someone who can cook and preserve food for winter, someone who can handle a rifle in case of trouble. It is hard work, no question, but it is honest and the pay would be fair. Room and board plus wages." Willa stared at him. "You are offering me a job to come live in the mountains with you." "I know how that sounds," Henry said quickly, "but it would be proper. The cabin has 2 rooms. You would have your privacy. And if you wanted to leave at any time, I would bring you back to Fort Worth or wherever you wanted to go, no questions asked. I'm just saying, if you want an alternative to the saloon, I can offer you one." "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." Henry met her eyes. "Because I know enough. I know you are a decent woman trying to survive in a hard situation. I know you are educated and capable. And I know that if I leave you here at the saloon, men like Chet Morrison will keep making your life difficult no matter how many times I threaten them. Up in the mountains, you would not have to deal with that. You could work in peace." Willa's mind was racing. The offer was shocking and improper and completely insane. She barely knew this man. He could be lying about everything. He could be dangerous. But then she thought about going back to the saloon tomorrow, about the looks and the whispers and the constant vigilance she had to maintain. She thought about Chet and Frank and Tom, about how even after they apologized there would be others like them. She thought about her father and what he would want for her. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I will be in town for a few days at least, selling my furs and buying supplies." They finished their meal and Henry walked her back to her boarding house, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. At the door, Willa turned to face him. "Thank you again for what you did today. No one has ever stood up for me like that." "Any decent man would have done the same," Henry said, but Willa shook her head. "No, they would not have. All those men in that saloon, they heard what Chet was saying and not one of them did anything. You did. That means something." Henry looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss Daniels. Think about my offer." Willa went inside and up to her small room, her mind churning. She lay in bed for hours, unable to sleep, weighing the impossible choice before her. Stay in Fort Worth and continue her difficult life at the saloon, or take a chance on a stranger and go to the mountains. She thought about Henry's kind eyes and the way he had given her a choice about the apologies. She thought about how he had called her decent and made everyone believe it. She thought about the strength in his arms and the gentleness in his voice. But most of all, she thought about freedom. Freedom from the whispers and the looks and the constant fear that one wrong step would destroy her completely. Freedom to work hard and be valued for it. Freedom to live without always looking over her shoulder. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through her window, Willa made her decision. She dressed carefully and walked through the still sleeping town to the Golden Eagle. True to his word, Henry was already there, standing in the street, and kneeling before him on the dusty ground were Chet Morrison, Frank Ridley, and Tom Hutchins. Chet's wrist was bound in a splint, and all three men looked like they had not slept at all. Henry saw Willa approaching and nodded to her. "The sun is about to rise," he said to the three men. "Time for those apologies." One by one, with the first rays of sun breaking over the eastern horizon, the three men repeated their apologies from the night before. This time there were witnesses, early risers and shop owners opening their stores, people sweeping porches and starting their daily routines. Word would spread quickly through the town. When they were finished, Henry dismissed them with a wave of his hand. They scrambled to their feet and hurried away, and Henry turned to Willa. "You are up early," he said. "I wanted to see this," Willa replied, "and I wanted to tell you something." "What is that?" "I accept your offer. I will come work for you in the mountains." Henry's face lit up with a smile that made her stomach flutter. "Are you certain? It is not an easy life up there." "I am certain. When do we leave?" "I need 2 more days to finish my business here. Can you be ready by then?" "I can be ready in 2 hours. I do not have much to pack." And that was how Willa Daniels found herself, 3 days later, sitting on a wagon next to Henry Yates as they rolled out of Fort Worth heading north. Her few possessions were packed in a small trunk in the back, along with supplies Henry had purchased for the winter. She had given notice at the saloon. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house had been sorry to see her go but understood, and now she was leaving behind the only life she had ever known. The journey took 2 weeks. They followed the trail north through Indian Territory, crossing the Red River and then the Canadian River, moving through endless prairie that gradually gave way to rolling hills. Henry was a good traveling companion, steady and reliable. He knew where to find water and good campsites. He could start a fire in minutes and cook a decent meal over it. At night, he laid out his bedroll on one side of the fire and insisted Willa take the other side, giving her space and privacy. They talked as they traveled, and Willa learned more about him. He had grown up in the mountains with his father, who had been a trapper before him. His mother had died when he was young, so his father had raised him alone, teaching him everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness. When his father passed 5 years ago, Henry had continued the life he knew, spending most of the year in the mountains and only coming down to civilization when necessary. "Does it not get lonely?" Willa asked one evening as they sat by their campfire. "Sometimes," Henry admitted. "But the mountains have their own company. The eagles and the elk, the sound of the wind in the pines. There is a peace up there that you cannot find anywhere else. I hope I can feel it too." "You will," he assured her. "I think you will take to mountain life better than you expect." As they moved further north and the land began to rise into the foothills of the Rockies, Willa felt something shift inside her. The air was cleaner here, sharper, and the horizon stretched forever. She had spent her whole life in Fort Worth, in dusty streets between buildings. Out here the world was so much bigger than she had imagined. They reached Summit Springs in early October, when the aspens were turning gold, and the nights carried a hint of frost. Henry's cabin sat in a high valley surrounded by pine forest, with a creek running cold and clear just 50 yards from the door. The cabin itself was larger than Willa had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. Inside there were indeed 2 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen space and a stone fireplace, and a smaller bedroom. "You take the bedroom," Henry said, carrying her trunk inside. "I sleep better out here by the fire anyway." Willa looked around with wonder. The cabin was well made and surprisingly comfortable. There were furs on the floor, and on the bed shelves stocked with supplies, a good iron stove for cooking. It was rustic, but it was clean and solid, a real home. "What do you think?" Henry asked, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice. "I think it is beautiful," Willa said honestly. "I think I am going to like it here." She was right. Over the following weeks, as the fall weather settled in and winter approached, Willa discovered that she was happier than she had been in years. Henry taught her the routines of mountain life. She learned to cook over both the fireplace and the stove, to preserve meat by smoking and salting, to recognize the tracks of different animals. She learned to shoot Henry's rifle, though the kick of it bruised her shoulder at first. She learned to read the weather and to judge how much firewood they would need. In return, she brought her own skills to the cabin. She could read and write, so she helped Henry keep records of his trap lines and his catches. She sewed and mended their clothes, keeping everything in good repair. She organized the cabin, making it more efficient and comfortable. She cooked better meals than Henry ever had alone, using wild herbs and roots to add flavor to the game he brought home. They fell into an easy partnership, working together through the days and sitting by the fire in the evenings. Henry would tell her stories about his life in the mountains, about close calls with bears and mountain lions, about finding hidden valleys no white man had ever seen. Willa would talk about the books her father had loved, reciting poetry and passages from memory. Henry listened like every word was precious. As the weeks turned to months and winter locked them in with snow that piled higher than the windows, something began to change between them. It was in the small things at first, the way Henry's hand would linger when he passed her something, the way Willa found herself watching him when he worked, admiring the strength in his shoulders and the competence in his movements, the way they sat closer by the fire each evening until their shoulders were touching. One night in late December, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled warm inside, Henry looked at Willa and said, "I have something I need to tell you." Willa's heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "I have been thinking a lot about why I offered you that job back in Fort Worth. I told myself it was because you needed help and I needed help, and that was true. But it was not the whole truth." "What was the whole truth?" Henry took a breath. "The whole truth is that from the moment I saw you in that saloon, holding your head high even though those men were trying to tear you down, I knew you were different, special. And when I defended you, it was not just because it was the right thing to do. It was because I could not stand the thought of anyone hurting you, not then and not now." Willa felt tears spring to her eyes. "Henry, I know this was supposed to be just a job," he continued. "I know I promised to be proper and keep my distance. But Willa, I have to tell you, I have fallen in love with you. Somewhere between Fort Worth and here, somewhere in all these days and nights together, I fell completely in love with you. And if you do not feel the same, that is all right. We can keep things as they are, but I could not keep it inside anymore." Willa reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and the warmth of it. "You think I do not feel the same? Henry, I have been falling in love with you since that first day, maybe even since that first moment when you stood up for me when no one else would. I was just afraid to say it, afraid you would think I was trying to trap you or take advantage." "Take advantage," Henry laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Willa, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. This cabin was just a place before. Now it is a home. You have given me something I did not even know I needed." He stood up and pulled her to her feet, and then his arms were around her, and his lips were on hers, and Willa felt like her heart would burst from happiness. He kissed her gently at first, then with more passion as she responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his long hair. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Henry pressed his forehead to hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "I know it is fast, and I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything. Marry me, Willa Daniels. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Willa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course I will marry you." They held each other for a long time, swaying slightly by the firelight, while outside the snow fell and the wind sang through the pines. Willa thought about the path that had brought her here, all the hardship and fear and uncertainty. And she thought about how it had all been worth it to find this moment, this man, this love. They were married in the spring, as soon as the mountain passes cleared enough to travel. They rode down to Denver City, a rough and tumble mining town where a circuit preacher was making his rounds. The ceremony was simple, held in a small church with the preacher's wife and a few curious miners as witnesses. Willa wore a new dress that Henry had bought for her, pale blue cotton with white lace, and Henry wore his best buckskin clothes with his hair freshly washed and tied back. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Henry kissed her with such tenderness that the miner's wife sighed and said it was the most romantic thing she had ever seen. They spent one night in a Denver hotel, a luxury that felt strange and confining after months in the mountains. The bed was soft, but Willa missed the familiar sounds of the forest and the creek. Still, it was wonderful to be truly alone with Henry, to finally give themselves to each other completely. He was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure Willa felt loved and cherished. Afterwards, lying in his arms, Willa said, "I never imagined my life would turn out like this." "Better or worse than you expected?" Henry asked, his fingers trailing through her dark hair. "Better," she said without hesitation. "So much better. When my father died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would just survive, day by day, alone and struggling. I never imagined I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Henry admitted. "I always thought I was meant to be alone. My father raised me to be independent, to not need anyone. But with you, I realized that independence is not the same as happiness. You make me want to share everything, to build something together." They returned to the cabin as husband and wife, and the summer passed in blissful contentment. Willa tended a garden she had planted, growing vegetables and herbs. Henry worked his trap lines and hunted game for their table. They explored the high country together, Henry showing Willa hidden waterfalls and meadows filled with wildflowers. They made love under the stars and by firelight, learning each other's bodies and hearts. In the fall, as the aspens turned gold again and the elk bugled their mating calls, Willa began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited to be sure, counting the days and noting the changes in her body. When she was certain, she told Henry one evening over dinner. He stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, and Willa felt a flutter of fear. But then he broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the cabin. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy?" Willa asked, though it was obvious he was. "Happy? Willa, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful and excited all at once." As winter closed in again, they prepared for the baby. Henry made a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving designs along the sides. Willa sewed tiny clothes and blankets. They talked about names and plans and what kind of parents they wanted to be. When Willa's time came, in the deep cold of February, Henry rode through a snowstorm to fetch a midwife from the nearest settlement, a 2-day journey each way. The midwife, a capable woman named Sarah who was married to a rancher, arrived just in time. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Henry thought he would go mad from hearing Willa's cries and not being able to help. But finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, his son was born. They named him Thomas, after Willa's father, and called him Tommy. He was a strong baby with a lusty cry in Henry's brown eyes. Henry held him with shaking hands, this tiny person who was half him and half Willa, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. He had thought he loved Willa as much as it was possible to love someone, but now that love expanded to include this small life they had created together. The years passed with the rhythm of the seasons. Tommy grew from baby to toddler to boy, running wild through the mountain meadows, learning to track animals with his father, learning to read with his mother. When he was 3, Willa gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah after the midwife who had helped them. Sarah was dark-haired like her mother but had Henry's fearless nature, climbing trees and exploring before she could barely walk. Henry continued his trapping, but he was more careful now, more cautious. He had a family depending on him, a family he loved more than his own life. Willa made the cabin into a real home, filled with laughter and love and the chaos of children. She taught both Tommy and Sarah to read and write and do mathematics, determined they would have the education her father had given her. They made occasional trips down to Fort Worth, though never for long. Henry had business there, selling furs and buying supplies. Willa visited Mrs. Hoffman at the restaurant and Sam at the Golden Eagle, people who had known her in her old life. The saloon seemed smaller and dirtier than she remembered, and she was always grateful to leave it behind and return to the mountains. On one such trip, when Tommy was 7 and Sarah was 4, they happened to cross paths with Chet Morrison. He was older now, worn down by hard living and hard drinking. His right wrist was bent at an odd angle, never having healed properly from when Henry broke it. He saw them on the street, Henry and Willa walking with their children, clearly a family and clearly happy. Chet stopped and stared, and for a moment Willa thought there might be trouble. But then Chet just nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement or maybe respect, and moved on. They never saw him again. As the children grew, the cabin felt smaller, so Henry built an addition, 2 more rooms for Tommy and Sarah. He was building something permanent now, something that would last. This was not just a trapper's cabin anymore. This was the Yates family homestead. When Tommy was 12, Henry began teaching him seriously about trapping and hunting, about surviving in the wilderness. But Willa insisted he also continue his education, and in the evenings she taught him history and literature and science. Tommy absorbed it all like a sponge, equally comfortable setting a trap line or discussing Shakespeare. Sarah was different, more restless and wild. She wanted to be wherever her father was, doing whatever he was doing. At 8 years old, she could shoot a rifle nearly as well as Henry, and she could ride a horse like she was born to it. Willa worried sometimes that Sarah was too rough, too unladylike, but Henry just laughed and said the mountains made people who they were meant to be. When Willa was 35, she gave birth to another son, a surprise baby they named William. He was a quiet, thoughtful child who loved to sit and listen to stories, who studied the world with wide eyes full of wonder. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when the snow piled so high they could not leave the cabin for weeks. There were lean times when game was scarce and they had to ration their supplies carefully. There were illnesses and injuries, the constant dangers of mountain life. But there was also joy. So much joy. First steps and first words and first successful hunts. Holidays celebrated by the big fireplace, with Willa cooking a feast and Henry telling stories. Summer nights lying on their backs watching the stars, all of them together, Henry pointing out constellations while Willa recited poetry. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry took Willa on a ride to a special place, a high meadow he had found years ago but never shown anyone. It was late spring, and the meadow was filled with wildflowers, a riot of color against the green grass. They sat together looking out over the valley, the cabin just visible far below. "You ever regret it?" Henry asked. "Giving up civilization for this life?" Willa turned to look at him. He was 40 now, his hair starting to show threads of gray, his face lined from years of sun and wind. But his eyes were the same, kind and steady and full of love. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "That day in the saloon when you defended me, you gave me more than just my reputation back. You gave me a whole new life, a better life than I ever could have imagined." "You gave me one too," Henry said. "Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. But you made me live. You made me understand what it means to truly love someone, to build something with them. You are my whole world, Willa, you and the children. Everything good in my life comes from you." They kissed there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers, and Willa felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt 10 years ago when Henry first kissed her in the cabin. Time had not dimmed their love at all. If anything, it had made it stronger, deeper, more essential. The children grew into young adults. Tommy became a skilled hunter and tracker, but he also inherited his grandfather's love of learning. At 18, he made the decision to go to Denver City and try to get more formal education, to become a teacher like his grandfather had been. It was hard for Henry and Willa to let him go, but they knew it was what he needed. Sarah showed no interest in leaving the mountains. At 16, she was as capable as any man, able to handle a rifle and a horse and survive on her own if she had to. She talked about finding a piece of land nearby and starting her own homestead someday. Henry privately thought she would need to find a very special man, one who could keep up with her wild spirit. William, at 10, was still figuring out who he was. He loved the mountains, but he also loved books and learning. Willa thought he might follow his brother to Denver City someday, but for now he was happy at home. The years continued to pass. Tommy did become a teacher, working in a school in Denver City. He married a kind woman named Elizabeth and gave Henry and Willa their first grandchildren, twin girls. Sarah surprised everyone by falling in love with a young rancher named Jack who had a homestead in the next valley. He was the one man who could match her strength and independence, and their wedding was a joyous affair with half the territory in attendance. William eventually left for the East to study medicine, a dream he had nurtured for years. Henry struggled with him being so far away, but Willa reminded him that they had raised their children to follow their hearts, and they had to trust in that. When Henry was 50, he took a bad fall while checking a trap line. He broke his leg badly and it laid him up for months. Willa nursed him through it with the same fierce devotion she had always shown, but the injury left him with a permanent limp. He could no longer run his trap lines the way he once had, but rather than despair, Henry adapted. He taught young men from the nearby settlements how to trap and hunt, passing on his knowledge. He built furniture and sold it, his skilled hands creating beautiful pieces from mountain wood. He spent more time with Willa, and they discovered new joys in simply being together, no longer having to constantly work to survive. Sarah and Jack took over most of the hunting and trapping, supplying the family with meat and income. Tommy visited whenever he could, bringing his growing family. William sent letters from the East, telling of his studies and his plans to eventually return west as a doctor. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. All their children and grandchildren, Sarah's husband, Tommy's wife, even some neighbors and friends from the territory. The cabin could not hold everyone, so they set up tents and gathered around a big bonfire outside. As the evening wore on and the children ran wild through the meadow, Henry pulled Willa aside. They walked to their favorite spot overlooking the valley, the place he had brought her on their 10th anniversary. 25 years, Henry said, his arm around her waist. Hard to believe. Best 25 years of my life, Willa said, leaning into him. Mine too. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I have been thinking about that day in Fort Worth, the day we met. I think about it often too. If I had not been on the porch at that exact moment, if I had not heard those men talking about you, our whole lives would be different. But you were there, Willa said. You heard them and you stood up for me when no one else would. You changed everything. We changed everything, Henry corrected. You took a chance on a stranger. You trusted me enough to leave everything you knew and come to the mountains. That took real courage. Willa thought about the woman she had been, frightened and alone in that saloon, and the woman she was now, confident and loved and surrounded by family. You gave me back my life that day, she said. And every day since, you have made it worth living. They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, just like that first evening they had walked to dinner together. Behind them, they could hear their family, the laughter and conversation, the sounds of life and love and joy. No regrets. Henry asked the same question he had asked 10 years ago. Not a single one, Willa answered, the same answer she had given then, and she meant it. From the darkness of that saloon to the light of the mountains, from fear and loneliness to love and family, her life had been transformed. Henry had defended her name and her honor that day in Fort Worth, and then he had given her everything else. His heart, his home, his children, his life. Those 3 men had apologized before the sun rose that morning, just as Henry had promised they would. But that was just the beginning of the story, not the end. The real story was what came after. The journey to the mountains, the slow building of trust and partnership, the moment they realized they loved each other, the wedding, the children, the life they built together day by day and year by year. As they walked back to the bonfire and their waiting family, Henry took Willa's hand. His grip was still strong despite his age, still steady and sure. She squeezed back, thinking how lucky she was, how blessed, how loved. Their youngest grandson, Tommy's son Henry, ran up to them. Grandpa, Grandma, come on. Grandma has to tell us a story. What story do you want to hear? Willa asked as they settled by the fire. Tell us how you and Grandpa met, the boy said, and all the other children echoed the request. Even the adults leaned in. They had heard the story before, but they never tired of it, so Willa told them. She told them about the saloon and the 3 men who had lied about her. She told them about Henry walking in and defending her honor. She told them about the apologies at dawn and the offer of work in the mountains. She told them about falling in love and getting married and building their life together. The children listened with wide eyes, and when she finished, the oldest grandson said, Grandpa must have been really brave. He was, Willa agreed, looking at her husband across the fire. He still is. Henry smiled at her, and in his eyes she could see the young man who had walked into that saloon so many years ago. Time had changed them both, had given them gray hair and wrinkles and scars. but it had not changed the essential truth of who they were to each other. She was still the woman he had defended, the woman he had offered a new life. He was still the man who had stood up for her, the man who had given her everything. And together, they had built something beautiful and lasting. The fire burned low and the stars came out, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms, and adults talked quietly about the old days and the days to come. Henry moved to sit beside Willa, and she leaned against his solid shoulder, feeling the warmth of him and the steady beat of his heart. This was happiness, she thought. This was what life was meant to be. Not perfect or easy, but full of love and meaning, full of family and connection. Full of days spent together and nights falling asleep in each other's arms. "Thank you," she whispered to Henry. "For what? For everything. For that day in the saloon, for bringing me here, for loving me, for our life together." Henry turned and kissed her forehead. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for making me the happiest man alive." Around them, the fire crackled and their family slept, and the mountains stood eternal in the darkness. And Willa closed her eyes and sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought them together, to whatever twist of fate had put Henry on that porch at exactly the right moment to hear what was happening inside the saloon. Everything that came after, all the joy and the love and the life, had flowed from that one moment, from his choice to defend her and her choice to trust him, from their choice to love each other and to keep choosing that love every day. Years later, when Henry and Willa were both old and gray, when their children were grown with children of their own, they still took walks to their special meadow. Henry moved slower now, leaning on a cane, and Willa's hair was pure white. But they still held hands and they still looked at each other with the same love. "You remember those 3 men?" Willa asked one day. "The ones from the saloon, Chet, Frank, and Tom," Henry said. "I remember." "Why?" "I was just thinking how they tried to destroy me with their lies, but in the end they gave me the greatest gift. If they had not said those things, you never would have stepped in. We never would have met. None of this would have happened." "Life is strange that way," Henry agreed. "The worst moments can lead to the best ones. I forgave them, you know, a long time ago. I forgave them and I even felt grateful to them in a way." Henry smiled. "That is because you are a better person than I am. I never quite forgave them for trying to hurt you." "My protector," Willa said fondly. "Always." "Always," Henry agreed. When Henry passed away at the age of 72, surrounded by his wife and children and grandchildren, his last words were, "I love you, Willa. Best decision I ever made." Willa held his hand as he slipped away, tears streaming down her face but grateful for every moment they had shared. She had loved him for more than 40 years, and she would love him for however many years she had left. She lived another 5 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, telling stories about Henry and their life together. She never remarried. How could she, when she had already found the love of her lifetime? When her own time came, she went peacefully in her sleep. Her last thought was of Henry, of that first moment she had seen him walking into the saloon, tall and strong and sure. She smiled and then she was gone. They buried her next to Henry in the meadow they had loved, the one filled with wildflowers in the spring. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all came to pay their respects, telling stories and remembering the love that had started it all. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the mountains, people said they could feel the presence of Henry and Willa still there in that meadow, still together, still in love. Still grateful for that one moment in a Fort Worth saloon when a mountain man defended a woman's name and changed both their lives forever. The cabin stood for generations, maintained by their descendants, a monument to what they had built together. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. The story of how three men apologized before the sun rose, and how that apology was just the beginning of the greatest love story the family would ever know. And in Fort Worth, though the Golden Eagle Saloon eventually burned down and was rebuilt and changed hands many times, there were still old-timers who remembered the day the mountain man walked in and stood up for Willa Daniels. They remembered the apologies at dawn, remembered seeing Henry and Willa together in those few days before they left for the mountains. Some said it was the most romantic thing that had ever happened in Fort Worth. A woman in trouble, a strong man to defend her, and a love that lasted a lifetime. It was the kind of story people told around campfires and dinner tables, the kind that made young women sigh and young men want to be heroes. But for Willa and Henry, it was never a story. It was just their life. A life that started with violence and fear but blossomed into something beautiful. A life built on respect and partnership and deep, abiding love. A life that proved that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best ones, and that sometimes a single choice to do the right thing can change everything. In the end, that was their legacy. Not the furs Henry sold or the children Willa raised, though those were important too, but the example they set. The proof that love could flourish in hard places, that strength and gentleness could exist in the same person, that a man could be both fierce and kind, that a woman could be both soft and strong. Their love story became part of the fabric of the territory, woven into its history as surely as the mountains and the rivers. And long after they were gone, people still remembered, still told the tale of the mountain man who defended her name in the saloon, and the three men who apologized before the sun rose that morning, and the love that grew from that moment of courage and honor. It was a love story for the ages, played out against the backdrop of the Wild West, full of danger and adventure and the quiet moments that matter most. It was a story of two people who found each other when they needed each other most, who built a life together against all odds, who loved each other until their last breaths and beyond. And it all started on one afternoon in September of 1878, when Henry Yates walked into the Golden Eagle Saloon and saw a woman being wronged, and decided to do something about it. That decision, that moment of choosing right over easy, set in motion a chain of events that brought two souls together and created a legacy that would last for generations. That was the real story. Not just the confrontation or the apologies, but everything that came after. The journey, the love, the life. The years of happiness built on a foundation of respect and trust. The children and grandchildren who carried forward the values Henry and Willa had lived by. The enduring truth that one person can make a difference, that standing up for what is right matters, that love is worth fighting for. And so the story ended as it began, with a moment of courage that changed everything. But between that beginning and end were years and years of love, of laughter, of struggle and triumph, of ordinary days made extraordinary by being lived together. That was the true gift Henry and Willa gave each other and their family, not just the dramatic moments but the quiet ones. Not just the grand gestures, but the small daily choices to love and honor each other. Their story proved that heroes are real, that true love exists, that happy endings are possible. And in a hard land during hard times, that was a message of hope that resonated through the generations. A light in the darkness, a promise that good things could still happen to good people. The mountain man defended her name in the saloon. Three men apologized before the sun rose that morning, and Willa and Henry lived happily ever after. The end.